It was supposed to be the beginning of forever. A dream honeymoon in Fiji, surrounded by turquoise waters, golden sunsets, and the promise of a new life together. But within days, that dream became a nightmare. On the morning of March 7, 2009, a housekeeper at the Coral Palms Resort hesitated outside room 518. The "Do Not Disturb" sign had been hanging on the door for far too long. Something felt off. What she found inside would shake the entire island. The room was in ruins, furniture overturned, shattered glass glistening on the floor, blood smeared across the walls. And at the center of it all, the lifeless body of 65-year-old Evelyn Mallister. Her once bright eyes were closed forever, her hands covered in defensive wounds, a silent testament to her desperate fight for survival. Near her body, a broken champagne bottle lay discarded, its jagged edges stained red. A weapon in a crime of passion, or premeditated murder. And then there was her husband, Gerald Mallister. Just days before, he had vowed to love and protect her. Now, he sat on the balcony, his shirt wrinkled, stained with blood. His hands, bruised and raw, rested on the chair's armrests. He barely moved. He barely spoke. And when police asked him what had happened, he had only one thing to say. Things didn't go as planned. But what did that mean? What had really happened in room 518? The answers lay in the hidden cracks of their whirlwind romance, secrets that had been buried, warning signs that had been ignored. And by the time Evelyn realized the truth, it was already too late. This is the tragic story of a honeymoon turned homicide. Welcome to True Crime Story Network. A huge thank you to my viewers, especially my subscribers, for your support as we continue to improve and bring you both well-known and untold true crime stories. If you believe stories like Evelyn Mallister's deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe and stay updated. Now, let's get into the details of what really happened. The Coral Palms Resort was the kind of place people imagined when they thought of paradise, pristine beaches stretching as far as the eye could see, the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore, and a sun that bathed the island in golden light. It was a destination for lovers, a place where couples came to celebrate their new beginnings. For Evelyn and Gerald Mallister, it was supposed to be exactly that, a honeymoon, a fresh start, the promise of a lifetime together. They had arrived at the luxurious resort just days before, hand in hand, stepping into what was meant to be the most romantic chapter of their lives. But just 6 days after checking in, paradise turned into a nightmare. It was the morning of March 7, 2009, when a housekeeper made her way down the long, sunlit hall of the resort's 5th floor. Her cart was stocked with fresh linens, folded towels, and delicate soaps, each one neatly arranged. Room after room, she knocked gently on the doors, waiting for a response before letting herself in. But when she reached room 518, she hesitated. The "Do Not Disturb" sign had been hanging on the door for 2 days. Guests often left them up after a long night out, but something about this one felt wrong. She knocked once. No answer. Again. Still silence. With a growing sense of unease, she took her master key, slowly pushed open the door, and stepped inside. What she saw next would haunt her forever. The room was in ruins. The once pristine honeymoon suite, decorated with rose petals and luxury linens just days before, was now a scene of chaos and destruction. The furniture had been overturned, glass shards glittered across the floor, and thick smears of blood stained the cream-colored walls. The air smelled of spilled alcohol, sweat, and something metallic, something unmistakably tied to violence. And in the middle of it all, Evelyn Mallister lay motionless on the cold marble floor. Her body was twisted unnaturally, her face bruised and swollen, deep lacerations covered her arms and torso. Her fingers, frozen in stillness, bore defensive wounds, evidence of a fight she never had a chance of winning. Nearby, a broken champagne bottle lay discarded, its jagged edges coated in blood. What had once been a symbol of celebration and new beginnings had become a weapon in a brutal and horrifying crime. The housekeeper's breath caught in her throat. Then, she screamed. The piercing cry echoed down the hall, sending a shockwave through the quiet morning air. Guests in nearby rooms stepped outside, confused, their vacation bliss shattered by the chilling sound. Within minutes, resort security rushed to the suite, followed by the local police. As officers secured the scene, an eerie detail sent a new wave of unease through the investigators. Sitting silently on the balcony, just a few feet from where his wife's body lay, was Gerald Mallister. Gerald sat completely still, his chair angled toward the ocean as if he were merely enjoying the view. The breeze ruffled his wrinkled linen shirt, but he didn't move. His hands, bruised and bloodied, rested on the armrests, his fingers curling slightly, like a man trapped in a daze. His shirt was stained with what appeared to be blood, the fabric stiff where it had dried. When officers approached, he barely acknowledged them. His eyes were vacant, unfocused, as if he had retreated into some distant place within his mind. "Mr. Mallister," one of the officers called out. No response. The officer took a cautious step forward, lowering himself slightly to meet Gerald's gaze. "Mr. Mallister, can you hear me?" Finally, Gerald turned his head slightly, his expression eerily blank. And then, in a quiet, hoarse voice, he muttered just 6 words. "Things didn't go as planned." That was all. No explanation. No panic. Just those cryptic words, spoken as if he were reciting a fact rather than addressing the brutal murder of his wife. Something about his demeanor sent a chill through the officers. This was not the reaction of a man who had just lost his wife in a tragic accident. This was something else entirely. Gerald was immediately taken into custody as forensic teams swept through the room, documenting every bloodstain, every shattered piece of glass, every possible clue that could unravel what had happened inside room 518. But as investigators began piecing together the final moments of Evelyn Mallister's life, one thing became disturbingly clear. This was not just a case of a honeymoon gone wrong. This was a crime rooted in deception, manipulation, and a darkness that had been hiding just beneath the surface all along. Long before Evelyn Mallister set foot in Fiji, before she walked down the aisle and said, "I do," there were signs. Signs that something wasn't quite right. She had always been a woman of warmth, a retired schoolteacher from Savannah, Georgia, known for her kindness and resilience. She had loved deeply once before, spending years caring for her late husband as he battled cancer. When he passed, the grief was unbearable, but she had never allowed it to turn her bitter. But grief has a way of making people vulnerable. Evelyn longed for companionship, for someone to share quiet evenings with, to laugh with, to grow old with. And that longing is what eventually led her to a veterans fundraiser in Atlanta, Georgia, in September 2008. That night, in a grand ballroom adorned with American flags and polished medals, she met Gerald Mallister. He was different from the others in the room. Tall, rugged, with a face that looked like it had seen both war and hardship. He carried himself with authority, his voice deep and commanding. The guests at the fundraiser listened intently as he spoke, stories of Vietnam, of sacrifice, of brotherhood. Evelyn was drawn in. Gerald noticed. And from that moment, he never let her go. Their connection was instant. Gerald was charming, attentive, and made Evelyn feel special. She had spent years being the strong one, carrying the weight of loss alone, but Gerald made her feel something different. Wanted. Cherished. Safe. Or so she thought. What started as casual conversation quickly blossomed into a whirlwind romance. Gerald visited Evelyn often in Savannah, bringing her flowers, taking her to dinners, whispering promises of a future together. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt like she had been given a second chance at love. But not everyone saw it that way. Her younger sister, Margaret, didn't trust him. "Something isn't right about him," she had told Evelyn more than once. "He's too perfect. Too smooth. There's something he's not telling you." Evelyn had waved it off, insisting Margaret was just being protective. She wanted to believe Gerald was everything he claimed to be. She ignored the warning signs. She ignored the doubt creeping into her own heart. And in December 2008, just 3 months after they met, Gerald proposed. 3 months. It had only been 3 months since Evelyn Mallister first met Gerald, yet there he was, kneeling before her, a diamond ring glinting in the dim candlelight of an upscale restaurant. The other diners watched, some smiling, some clapping, as Evelyn sat frozen in surprise. Gerald's deep, unwavering voice filled the space between them. "Marry me, Evelyn. Let's build a life together." It was fast, too fast. A part of Evelyn knew this. But love has a way of silencing doubt. She hesitated, just for a moment. Then, looking into the eyes of the man who had made her feel alive again, she pushed aside her uncertainty. "Yes," she whispered. The restaurant erupted into applause. Gerald slid the ring onto her finger, and just like that, Evelyn Mallister was engaged. She told herself this was fate. That love didn't follow timelines. That when something felt right, you didn't question it. But deep down, in the quiet corners of her mind, a small, unshakable voice whispered that something wasn't right. In the weeks following the engagement, Evelyn was swept up in a whirlwind of wedding planning and dreams of a new future. She picked out invitations, chose a dress, and made arrangements for their honeymoon in Fiji. But while she was planning a life together, Gerald was planning something else. One evening in January 2009, just 2 months before the wedding, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Gerald to come home. His laptop sat open, the blue glow of the screen casting faint shadows on the wall. She wasn't the type to snoop. But as she stood to turn it off, something caught her eye. An email thread. At first, it seemed like a standard conversation, until she saw the name. Angela. A younger woman. Someone she had never heard of. With trembling fingers, she scrolled through the messages. Flirtatious. Personal. Intimate. A history between them that didn't align with the stories Gerald had told her. Her stomach twisted. Had Gerald lied? Had he been seeing someone else just months before proposing to her? By the time Gerald walked through the door, Evelyn was waiting. She held up the laptop, the email open on the screen. She wanted the truth. But Gerald didn't look shocked or remorseful. He smirked. That was nothing. Angela was just a fling. She meant nothing to me. He waved his hand dismissively, as if Evelyn's feelings were overreactions. I love you, he insisted. That's all that matters. Evelyn wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. So, she nodded, swallowed her unease, and let him pull her into an embrace. But in that moment, the first crack in their relationship had formed. And cracks, no matter how small, always have a way of widening. As the wedding day drew closer, Gerald made another request, one that should have sent Evelyn running. He needed money. Not just a little. A significant amount. Lingering debts, he called them. Nothing serious, just something to clear before they started their new life. He asked Evelyn to co-sign a loan. She hesitated. Financial security had always been important to her. Her late husband had worked hard to leave her comfortable, and she had never been reckless with money. But Gerald was so convincing. He framed it as a test of trust, a necessary step toward their future. It's just paperwork, he assured her. Nothing to worry about. Evelyn, wanting to believe the best in him, eventually agreed. She transferred a large portion of her savings into a joint account. Gerald kissed her hands, promising he'd repay her trust with unwavering devotion. But the moment she signed those documents, something changed. Friends noticed she was quieter, more withdrawn. Less like herself. She confided in her best friend, Maria. I love him, but I don't know. Something doesn't feel right. Maria's response was immediate. Then don't marry him. But Evelyn had already made up her mind. In late February 2009, just 1 week before their wedding, she told her sister Margaret that she was ready. This trip will be good for us, she said. Once we're in Fiji, away from all the stress, we'll remember why we fell in love. She smiled. But Margaret saw the hesitation in her eyes. Because deep down, Evelyn knew she was ignoring something. Evelyn and Gerald arrived in Fiji just a few days after their wedding. At first, everything seemed perfect. They checked into the Coral Palms Resort, a place known for its stunning beaches and five-star service. Their suite overlooked the ocean, and each morning, Evelyn would stand on the balcony, watching the waves roll in. But something was different. Gerald was distant. Irritable. Drinking more than usual. At first, Evelyn tried to ignore it. Tried to convince herself it was just stress. Until the night of March 6, 2009. That evening, the couple had dinner at the resort's beachfront restaurant. Witnesses remember Evelyn looking uncomfortable. She was tense, distracted. Gerald, on the other hand, drank heavily, barely speaking. Then, something happened. Evelyn's voice rose. Gerald leaned in sharply. The conversation turned heated. Guests noticed Evelyn gesture forcefully, frustration clear on her face. And then, without warning, she pushed back her chair and walked away. Gerald stayed behind. Security footage later captured Evelyn walking alone along the beach. She sat on a bench near the water, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. A guest saw her, debated approaching her, but decided against it. She looked like she wanted to be alone. At 2 a.m., security footage showed Gerald leaving the resort's bar and heading toward their suite. He hesitated outside the door. Paced back and forth. Then, finally, he went inside. What happened next, only one person lived to tell. The warm night air in Fiji carried the faint hum of laughter and clinking glasses from the resort's outdoor bar, where the last few guests were finishing their drinks beneath the moonlit sky. It was the perfect ending to another day in paradise. But inside room 518, paradise was unraveling. At 2:12 a.m., Gerald Mallister swiped his keycard and stepped into the suite. The surveillance cameras in the hallway caught his movements, his steps uneven, his body swaying slightly from the alcohol he had consumed at the bar. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a bedside lamp. The sound of waves crashing outside the balcony doors mixed with the low murmur of the air conditioning. And then, there was Evelyn. She stood near the window, her back turned, her shoulders rigid. She didn't acknowledge him as he entered. She didn't need to. Gerald was already seething. His blood boiled from their earlier argument at dinner, from the way she had embarrassed him, from the way she had left him sitting alone while guests whispered about their not-so-happy honeymoon. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And then, in a voice so quiet it was nearly drowned out by the ocean breeze, Evelyn said 6 words that would change everything. "I know what you did, Gerald." Gerald froze. His breath hitched in his throat. Evelyn turned to face him now, her eyes red from crying, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. "Angela," she said, the name rolling off her tongue like a blade. Gerald's fists clenched. "You lied to me," Evelyn continued, her voice shaking. "About everything. About the money. About your past. About her." She took a step forward, standing her ground. "And I won't be your next mistake." That was it. That was the moment. Something inside Gerald snapped. He lunged at her, his hands grabbing her wrists, his grip so tight that Evelyn gasped. She tried to break free, twisting her arms, nails digging into his skin. But Gerald was stronger. A struggle erupted in the once idyllic honeymoon suite. The champagne bottle from their welcome package crashed to the floor, shattering into jagged pieces. Evelyn managed to push Gerald back, her breath ragged, her heart pounding against her ribs. She scrambled toward the door, fumbling with the handle. But Gerald reached her first. He grabbed her by the arm and yanked her backward, sending her crashing onto the glass-strewn floor. Evelyn screamed, a sound so sharp and desperate that guests in nearby rooms would later recall waking up in the middle of the night, unsettled, unsure of what they had heard. Her hands flailed against him, a last act of defiance, of survival. But Gerald, in his drunken rage, didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. With terrifying force, he brought down a jagged piece of broken glass. Once. Twice. 3 times. Blood splattered across the cream-colored walls, pooling onto the cold marble tiles beneath them. Evelyn's body twitched, then fell still. The fight was over. Gerald stumbled backward, panting, his hands coated in his wife's blood. His eyes flickered around the room, as if waking from a dream that had just turned into a waking nightmare. He had killed her. For the next few moments, there was only silence. No more screaming. No more struggling. Just the faint sound of the waves outside, as if the ocean itself had swallowed the violence that had just occurred within these walls. Gerald stood there, his breath shallow, his heart racing. His mind was hazy, blurred from the alcohol, the adrenaline, the sheer weight of what he had just done. Slowly, he stepped over Evelyn's lifeless body, her fingers still curled from where she had tried to defend herself. He walked onto the balcony, his eyes locking onto the endless stretch of dark water beyond. And then, he sat. He didn't run. He didn't call for help. He simply sat in that chair, his hands resting on the armrests, his bloodied knuckles exposed beneath the moonlight. Hours passed. At some point, he must have fallen asleep. And when the housekeeper knocked on the door the next morning, Gerald was still sitting there. Unmoving. Waiting. By 9 a.m., the Coral Palms Resort was swarming with police officers. Yellow crime scene tape blocked off room 518. Guests whispered in hushed voices as crime scene investigators walked through the resort's hallways, collecting statements from those who had heard the commotion the night before. Inside the suite, forensic specialists combed through the wreckage. The champagne bottle, its shattered remains carefully bagged as evidence. The blood patterns, analyzed to determine the sequence of events. Gerald's knuckles, bruised, raw, consistent with a physical altercation. It didn't take long to piece together what had happened. There was no intruder. No forced entry. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't an accident. This was a murder. When investigators questioned Gerald, his answers were vague, disoriented. I was drinking. I don't remember. Things didn't go as planned. But the evidence told a different story. By March 20, 2009, Gerald Mallister was officially charged with second-degree murder. The man who had promised to love Evelyn forever had instead stolen her life in a moment of rage. And soon, he would have to answer for it. By December 2009, the case against Gerald Mallister had gained national attention. Reporters packed the courtroom. True crime enthusiasts followed every update. And in the front row, Evelyn's family sat in silent grief, clutching onto the last memories of a woman who had given so much and asked for so little. For weeks, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Gerald. His history of deception. His financial motives. His violent temper, hidden beneath a charming facade. Witness after witness took the stand, hotel guests, forensic experts, Evelyn's closest friends. The defense, in turn, tried to paint Gerald as a man suffering from PTSD, a man who had simply lost control in a drunken haze. But the jury wasn't convinced. On December 14, 2009, after 3 agonizing weeks of testimony, the courtroom fell silent as the jury returned with their verdict. A hush fell over the room. The judge turned to Gerald. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Margaret, Evelyn's sister, gripped the worn photograph of Evelyn in her hands, her fingers trembling. Gerald showed no emotion. The judge handed down his sentence. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. For Evelyn's family, it was justice. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could ever be enough. Because Evelyn should still be here. She should have been planning retirement trips, baking for her grandchildren, growing old in a home filled with laughter. Instead, she had placed her trust in the wrong man. And it had cost her everything. To the world, Evelyn Mallister became another tragic cautionary tale. But to those who loved her, she was more than a victim. She was a teacher. A sister. A friend. And her story will never be forgotten. Before you go, if you found Evelyn's story heartbreaking, you won't believe what happened in the next case we're covering. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. And tell us in the comments, was Gerald's crime premeditated? Could Evelyn have escaped this fate if she had listened to her gut? We read every comment, and we want to hear your thoughts.